Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. Again, good afternoon. I'm Dr. Marlise Gonzalez-Fernandez. I'm the interim director of the Department of Physical Medicine and Rehab. And on behalf of Dr. Jeffrey Palmer and the department, I welcome you today. So again, many friends, old and new, in this audience, so welcome to you all as well. Again, it's a special day for the department when we get to bring this second annual lectureship dedicated to advancing faculty, residents, and the knowledge of rehabilitation topics. And again, this lectureship sets the stage for leaders in the field to showcase research and scientific developments, advancements, and understanding. So it is my honor that we're joined today by Dr. Palmer, who previously served as our director from 2004 to 2014. And we're very grateful to him and his wife, Sarah, for the creation of this endowed lectureship. And today, we are honored to have with us Dr. Daniel Lieberman for the lecture we're going to hear. He is the Edwin M. Lerner II Professor of Biological Sciences and Chair of the Department of Human Evolutionary Biology at Harvard. He received his degrees from Harvard and Cambridge and taught at Rutgers University and George Washington before joining Harvard. Again, he studies and teaches how and why the human body is the way it is and how our evolutionary history affects health and disease. So let's join me in welcoming Dr. Lieberman.
Thank you. And hopefully this will work. And I'm not getting the slides here. Hold on, make sure this works. Okay, yes, now it's working. Before I get started, I just want to say thank you, Jeff and Sarah, for this. It's a real honor to be here. I have known, I don't know when I first heard about Jeff Palmer, but my PhD advisor was is actually still alive, wonderful professor named Fuzz Crompton. And Fuzz and Jeff collaborated on all kinds of interesting projects. And Jeff was always held up to me as the kind of physician researcher who's also interested in evolution. And I think I've kind of hopefully come the other direction and being an evolutionary biologist who's become interested in health and disease. And it's been a real inspiration. And then I'll show you what we actually collaborated on some projects. So I have no disclosures. And I think I'll skip over the objectives because you'll figure them out as we go on. But I just wanted to say a little bit about my ontogeny here, my evolutionary history here. So I started off as somebody who studied heads. I worked on the development and function of chewing and swallowing and various other aspects of craniofacial biology. And we collaborated on two really wonderful papers with Karen Hiyamaya. Some of that information I put into my book, The Evolution of the Human Head. Because I was a head guy, I got really interested in the problem of how we stabilize our heads during running, which turns out to be a really interesting problem. And that actually began because I was doing some research on pigs and not to study the head stabilization. We were looking at something totally else, different. And a colleague of mine came into the room and said that pig couldn't hold its head still when it was running, whereas humans, when we run like quadrupeds, we're actually able to stabilize our heads remarkably, even when we're running backwards on a treadmill. And that led to some research about the biomechanics of head stabilization. And that led to this kind of aha moment that turns out we have this really interesting, I'm not going to talk about it today, we have this really interesting passive mass damper head stabilization system that we evolved. And you can see it in the fossil record. And it showed up around 2 million years ago. And we ended up writing this paper in Nature paper, which came out in 2004. And that got me more and more interested in the evolution of physical activity and humans running long distances and stuff like that. And before I knew it, I slowly started doing more and more work on locomotion and on the evolution of human physical activity. And I'm really no longer a head guy. I'm really a physical activity guy. So now I'm really interested in how and why humans evolved to be physically active and how that promotes health. So we've been looking at running, and we look at throwing and carrying and digging and sitting and, well, or physical inactivity as well. Do lots of research on that. We've done work on barefoot running, which has earned me some notoriety. And I do it by combining comparative anatomy and paleontology. I still love fossils and still do some work in Kenya. We do field work. A lot of my field work has been in Africa, though I've also done some work in Mexico. And we have long-standing projects in Kenya. We've also started one in Rwanda, where we study how people use their bodies and try to bring the lab out into the field. But of course, in my lab at Cambridge, we do motion capture and electromyography and respirometry and God knows all kinds of other crazy sort of stuff. As you can see, we take people's heads off too when we run them on the treadmill. But today, what I'd like to talk about are two sort of why questions, because that's what evolution is about. Evolution is about asking why things are the way they are, right? And I'd like to start by talking about why we evolved to exercise, and in particular, talk about some new data that's actually just been accepted for publication in PNAS about the evolution of our unique metabolism and how it's related to physical activity and exercise. And then I'd like to talk about another paper we published fairly recently in PNAS called the active grandparent hypothesis, but it's a hypothesis to try to explain why, as we get older, physical activity becomes not less, but actually more important for extending health span as well as lifespan. So that's where we're headed today. And as always, the lens I'm using is the lens of evolutionary biology. And there's this famous expression that nothing makes sense except in biology except in the light of evolution. It was published by, it's actually a paper by Theodosius Dobzhansky, published in 1972. And I would like to sort of amend that, which is saying that nothing in biology, including health and disease, makes sense except in the light of evolution. And that's led to the growth of a new field, which I don't know if it's being taught much at Johns Hopkins yet, but hopefully it will, called evolutionary medicine, right? And evolutionary medicine applies evolutionary theory and evolutionary data to problems of health and disease. And it's important, not so much for treating individuals, though it can be very important for treatment, especially for diseases like cancer, but it's especially important for understanding why, understanding any why question about etiology of any kind of disease and health. Okay, so let's begin with the first question, which is that why did we evolve to exercise? And what was the evolution of our unique pattern of physical activity and metabolism? And I'm going to start the story. We could, of course, start the story back in, millions and millions of years ago. I'm going to go back only about 7 million years ago to the last common ancestor of humans and chimpanzees. And this is a bit of a contentious topic, but I will go to my grave arguing that the last common ancestor of human chimpanzees was very much like a chimpanzee. And a major reason for arguing that is that gorillas and chimpanzees are basically scaled versions of each other, right? Matt Ravosa here is an expert on scaling, but if you take a chimpanzee, you pump it up with a bicycle pump, where you basically get a gorilla, right? If you obey the laws of scaling. And so unless all the similarities between gorillas and chimpanzees evolved independently, then they would, which is statistically impossible, then the last common ancestor of gorillas and chimpanzees, as well as chimpanzees and humans, must have been relatively chimpanzee-like. And that has important implications because chimpanzees, and for that matter, gorillas and also orangutans, all the great apes, are couch potatoes. They don't move very much. This is a paper we just recently published a few years ago, actually last year, looking at step counts from various kinds of primates. And you can see that orangs barely move at all. Gorillas maybe walk 1 kilometer a day. Chimpanzees will walk about 2 to 3 kilometers a day. If any of you have ever had the chance to spend time in the wild watching chimpanzees, it sounds very exciting, but I can promise you it's not very exciting. Bring a book. They basically spend half their day just putting food into their mouth, waiting for their stomachs to empty so they can start that process again. They're basically eating all day long. Something that Dr. Palmer studied, right? Whereas hunter-gatherers are very physically active. Typical hunter-gatherers walk between 9 and 15 kilometers every day. There are no weekends, there are no holidays, there's no retirement. That's what they do. So to put that into perspective, the average female hunter-gatherer in a tropical environment basically walks from LA to Baltimore every year, right? That's the typical amount of physical activity that they get just from walking, okay? By the way, chimpanzees also do a little bit of climbing, but not very much. They actually climb only about 100 meters a day. So one way to evaluate that is to ask just how much more energy do humans spend on physical activity than other animals. I'm going to explain this energy, this quotient system in a second. But if you correct for body size and body composition and various environmental temperature, et cetera, and you measure how much physical activity animals do, and you set average mammals to a value of 1, turns out that apes are about half as active as most mammals per body size again, corrected for environmental temperature and body composition, right? So we evolved from couch potatoes, and that's extremely important because during our evolutionary history, we increased our physical activity levels by more than 2.5-fold, by more than 260%. That's a massive selection for increased physical activity that occurred since the last common ancestor of humans and chimpanzees. So humans are actually more active on average than your average mammal. That is not humans in Baltimore or Boston, but humans in the rest of the world, right? Hunter-gatherers, okay? What we used to be for millions of years. So how did that happen? Well, that happened, of course, didn't happen overnight. It happened through various intermediate transitional stages. And the very first stage is, of course, a super interesting one, and I've had the honor to work on, which is just the origins of bipedalism, right? So this is the Chad skull, Sahelanthropus chadensis. This is about a 7 million year old cranium that I had the fun of working on. And we know this is a upright biped because when it was walking around, looking forward, as all animals do, its neck pointed downwards. The upper cervical vertebrae were vertical, right? So that tells us it was a biped. You know, what kind of biped, we don't really know very much. This is a femur from Kenya that's about 6 million years old. I won't go into all the details, but anatomically, it's clearly a biped. And we have this partial skeleton from Ethiopia from a species called Ardipithecus ramidus that's about 4.5 million years old. And there's all kinds of evidence that it was some form of biped. But it's still not quite clear what kind of bipeds these were. And they have arms and upper bodies that were clearly adapted for climbing. Things began to change. And by 4 million years ago, we have the genus called Australopithecus, right? So you all heard of Lucy. This is Lucy, by the way. Plenty of other fossils from the species, including nearly complete skeletons. And we have lots of evidence that the Australopithecines were very effective walkers. They were still able to climb trees, but they were pretty darn good walkers. Many of you have seen the famous footprints from Laetoli, which are kind of a smoking gun evidence for their walking. We also can guess they were probably digging as well. But there's pretty compelling evidence that they were effective walkers. Now, bipedalism, we often think of bipedalism, if we do it, it must be great, right? Because bipedalism enables us to have tools. It enables us to gesticulate, enables us to do all kinds of wonderful things, right? But it's also important, and we've done some experiments. We've actually got retired chimpanzees from Hollywood that are living a retirement in a ranch in Northern California. We cajoled them to do respirometry while they were on a treadmill. And found that chimpanzees are really expensive when they walk. They spend about twice as much energy as a typical mammal, including humans, moving a kilo of their body a meter, right? It's a very inefficient form of locomotion. So bipedalism was probably a huge advantage because it saved an enormous amount of energy. If you're spending half as much energy traveling the same distance back in the days when the environment was changing and fruit was becoming more dispersed, it would have been a huge selective benefit. But importantly, there are costs, right? So one of them is that when you're a bipedal, you're awkward, right? And where's Lauren? We have a pregnant woman, and you have an enormous fetal mass in front of you, it makes you want to fall over. That's a problem. But the most important problem is that as soon as you have 2 legs instead of 4 legs, you're half as fast. You can generate half as much power with 2 legs as 4 legs. And as soon as we became bipedal, we became slow, right? And that made us vulnerable to predation from nasty things like saber-toothed tigers, which is not a good thing, right? So if I were a carnivore back in the old days, I wanted dinner and I didn't really want to work very hard, I'd eat a hominid, right? They're going to be easy prey, okay? And then things changed again. There's more climate change. Again, I'm not showing you all the data, but we know that starting around 2.8 million years ago or so, that's when the ice age began. That's when ice caps started to form on the north and south poles. This is a graph of the Earth's temperature over the last few million years from the oceans. And you can see that this is a period of major change. Now, of course, it's going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And it's very complicated, but we know from a lot of data that Africa at this time is essentially getting drier, right? There are, of course, no glaciers in Africa, but Africa is getting drier. And that's when we begin to get expansion of these sort of more open habitats, woodlands and grasslands. And that's also when we see the origin of what's called the hunting and gathering system, right? hunters and gatherers, we are all hunter-gatherers. In fact, until 600 generations ago, all human beings on the planet were hunter-gatherers, right? Farming was only invented about 600 generations ago in the oldest parts of the farming, the oldest kinds of farming. And hunting and gathering involves a mixture of behaviors, right? Well, there's hunting, right, which is meat eating. There's also scavenging, right? There's extractive gathering. So instead of just like picking berries off a tree, you dig for high quality resources. You're getting really high quality, high energy resources, which take more energy than just simply plucking things off trees. So we call that extractive gathering. Tool making and food processing are essential, and tools, stone tools first, show up around this time and are critical to the ability to chew and to process our food. And then finally, there must have been a lot of cooperation, right? Hunter-gatherers have division of labor, and there's food sharing and all kinds of important cooperative behaviors that underlie the system. So altogether, the hunting and gathering system has been a highly effective form of lifestyle. And importantly, one aspect of hunting and gathering is that it's actually requires a lot of work, right? We have data from for example, these are steps per day data, right? These are something happened to the scale and converted from Mac to PC. But you can see, I showed you this data before, that most of these creatures, our apes, have only a few steps per day, whereas hunter-gatherers have between 15,000 and 20,000 steps per day on average, right? It's an enormous effect. And of course, and if you put heart rate monitors on hunter-gatherers, they're engaging in moderate to vigorous physical activity. So moderate physical activity is defined as above about 50% of your maximum heart rate. They're engaging in at least 2.25 hours a day of moderate to vigorous physical activity, right? So you have to be pretty active when you're a hunter-gatherer. And all this walking, by the way, usually involves carrying. Hunter-gatherers are also doing other things. They're digging. This is a Hadza lady I filmed digging for tubers. They spend many hours a day digging. I'll show you a little bit more data on that. They climb, they carry, they do all kinds of things. Being a hunter-gatherer, right, before the modern era involved an enormous amount of physical activity. And one of the problems was, as we talked about before, was that meat was an important component of the diet, maybe about 30% on average in tropical hunter-gatherers. But that actually raises an interesting problem, which is how did hunter-gatherers manage to get their meat, right? The world's fastest runners with only 2 legs aren't very fast. Usain Bolt can run about 10.4 meters a second for maybe 20 to 30 seconds. He's an impressive guy, but he's got no natural weapons. He's got no claws, no fangs, nothing, right? How is he going to kill this antelope, which can run twice as fast as he can for about 4 minutes, right? He has no chance whatsoever of running down an antelope, right? And that the technology that we tend to think about for hunting didn't exist for millions of years, right? We know that we were hunting at least 2 million years ago. We have fossil record. We have archaeological evidence of complete animals that were unquestionably hunted by 2 million years ago. And yet the bow and arrow was invented less than 100,000 years ago. And just putting a pointed stone on a stick, right? Which is very important if you want to kill something, was invented less than 500,000 years ago. So the basic weaponry that we use for hunting did not exist for the first few million years of hunting. And so our hypothesis, began with a guy named Dave Carrier, and Dennis Bramall and I published this article in Nature in 2004, is that endurance running underlies this become hunters. If you want to be a hunter, you got to be able to run. If you think about most animals that hunt, they run, right? And I won't go into into the details, but we can see in the fossil record all kinds of adaptations, some of them which would benefit both walking and running, but there's all kinds of features in our bodies, like our big gluteus maximus, which is basically irrelevant for walking, our semicircular canals in our head, our arches in our feet, I could go on, right? There are tons of features in our bodies, literally from our heads to our toes, that make us really good at running, endurance running, not so much sprinting, and don't really have much benefit for walking. And of course, these enable millions of people to do running today. So here's how it works. So I've graphed speed on the x-axis in meters per second, and I've got a human, a greyhound, about the same mass as body mass as a human, a pony, and a horse. And in blue, for the human, I've got the endurance running range. So this is the speed at which humans can run marathons. That's how we defined it, right? Because that's obviously an endurance distance. Of course, most of us are down here. I mean, it's only elite athletes can run marathons at these speeds over here. So this is my speed over here. But I'm a middle-aged Harvard professor, but I can actually run faster than, as you can see here, the trot gallop transition speed of a dog, and pretty much at the trot gallop transition speed of a pony, right? And I'm a 60-year-old professor. I'm not going to win anything, right? And the reason that matters is that the trotting is the only endurance gait for quadrupeds. When quadrupeds start to gallop, they can't go very far for all kinds of reasons. One of them is respiratory and thermoregulatory. So all these animals can run way faster than humans, but humans can actually run pretty fast and above the trot gallop transition speed of many of these creatures. That's not even all entirely necessary to do that. And the other thing that's important about us is that when we run or do any physical activity, we're incredibly good at thermoregulation. That's because most animals cool by panting, right? Short little shallow breaths in the respiratory tract, right? And that causes evaporation of water on the tongue and in the epithelium, the oral epithelium, the nasal epithelium, and that cools blood flowing to those epithelial regions that then is used to cool the body. But there's only so much surface area that you can cool with that system. Whereas we excrete water all over our bodies. We basically turn our bodies into giant tongues, right? We millions and millions of eccrine glands all over our bodies. We've gotten rid of our fur. So we have much greater surface area that we can use for evapotranspiration. And the other thing is that when quadrupeds gallop, galloping is a seesaw gait, right? For the forelimbs, the hind limbs, forelimbs, hind limbs, forelimbs, hind limbs. And that means that with every stride, the diaphragm slams, the guts slam into the diaphragm, into a quadruped. And if you want to try this, take your family dog for a run and make it gallop, and you will see that the dog cannot pant and gallop at the same time. So animals that are galloping can't use that panting system to cool down, and that gives us another huge advantage, right? And so this enables us to do some really cool things. So one of them is called power scavenging. So power scavenging is, if any of you have been on safari in Africa, right? You're with a driver and they see some vultures in the distance and they drive to the vultures, right? Because underneath those vultures is going to be something fun to watch, right? Dead zebra or something like that, right? But in the old days, if you saw some vultures, you could also run there. And if it's in the middle of the day, you could get there before the hyenas, because the hyenas can't run very far or very fast in the day because it's too hot, right? And you can get there, and if you can, get there before the other scavengers, and then you have access to a carcass, right? This is called power scavenging. And hunter-gatherers still do this. But the even more important thing is what we call persistence hunting. So persistence hunting involves usually picking an animal, a big animal, the bigger the better, because bigger animals overheat faster than smaller animals, just like humans. And you chase it. Of course, now the animal can run way faster than you can, and it's going to hide in the bushes. But you track it, and then you chase it. And if you can get to it before it's completely cooled down, and then chase it again, its body temperature is going to go up, up, up with each kind of bout of tracking and chasing and tracking and chasing. And they're not running very fast. Turns out that hunter-gatherers, when they do this, run about 10-minute miles. That's like a 4-minute marathon pace, a very slow pace. And they're walking half the time. They're running half the time. So they're not even running very fast. But if they do this, it takes them usually about a half marathon distance. And they can walk right up to the animals. You can see this hunter-gatherer in the Kalahari did, and dispatch the animal without any danger, right? And it turns out to be a very effective form of hunting. And we have now data from more than 400 persistence hunts in the ethnographic literature. That's from these are observed ethnographic hunts that have been observed by people just recently, right? This is after the invention of the bow and arrow and all that. So we had data that it's actually more efficient than just walking. There's a wonderful paper that was just published in Nature, Ecology, and Evolution. Show that. And there's many other ways that running is involved. You can run animals into traps. You can chase them over cliffs, etc. But pretty much all these forms of hunting involved some form of endurance running. So we think that running played a role. It wasn't the only thing, but it played a role in the evolution of our physical activity. I just happen to be obsessed by running, so that's why I talked so much about running. But again, it's not just running. Humans evolved to walk. Mostly walking is the most fundamental form of physical activity. We evolved to dig, we evolved to climb, we evolved to carry things, we evolved to do all kinds of things, and running was just one part of the mix. And so that leads to the question of just how much energy did we evolve to spend on a daily basis on physical activity? And that turns out to be not an easy question to answer. And the standard way that people have been doing this for decades now is called the physical activity level. And many of you may be use this in your practice, but that's taking somebody's total energy expenditure and dividing it by their basal metabolic rate. And I don't know about you guys, but I hate ratios, right? Ratios are problematic for all kinds of reasons. One is that you don't know what's driving the ratio. Is it the total energy expenditure or the BMR? Turns out that also BMR doesn't scale isometrically with metabolism. There's all kinds of problems with trying to estimate physical activity levels from these two variables. So we've come up with what we think is a much better method, which is kind of the way in which we compare brain sizes and various other sorts of things, which is to look at cross mammals. So we want to use an independent data set of mammals and look at the scaling relationship between, for example, here, I've got resting energy expenditure against body mass, and we can see what the relationship is among mammals. So we don't have to make any assumptions about like what the scaling relationship ought to be. We just find out what the scaling relationship is. And then look at the relationship at this ratio between the observed metabolic rate and the expected metabolic rate. We can do this in a multiple regression method. So we can correct for body mass, we can correct for environmental temperature, we can correct for percent body fat. We can test it, and we have on modern human populations. So we can show that this is accurate, not just for comparing across populations and species, but also actually works for comparing individuals. So we can test the method. And when we do it, this is basically what we get. It's kind of a big summary slide, but this shows you, again, this is metabolic quotients. So in green, I've got resting, orange activity, and white is total energy. These are an out group of rodents. These are strepsirrhines. So these are, squirrel-like primates, like lemurs and things like that. And you can see that strepsirrhines and mammals have essentially the expected values, right? So this is what the quotients of 1, right? That means that they're average for their size, environmental temperature, et cetera. But look at monkeys. Monkeys have really high resting metabolic quotients and very low activity metabolic quotients. Monkeys have traded off physical activity they're spending less energy in physical activity, and they're using that energy to increase their metabolic rates. Monkeys have very high metabolic rates. And of course, that helps them have the extraordinary big brains that monkeys have, the long life histories, all the cool things that monkeys have. And that's exaggerated in chimpanzees, right? So chimpanzees are even more couch potatoes than monkeys and have even higher resting metabolic quotients. And again, chimpanzees are very long-lived and have very big brains, et cetera. Now look at humans, right? We've done something really extraordinary. We have even higher resting metabolic rates than other animals. And unlike chimpanzees, I showed you this before, but we've now increased our activity levels by 2.5-fold, right? It's a massive increase. And the result is our total energy expenditures are really high. We are a metabolically extravagant species, right? So just to show you that again, that's this activity. So monkeys and apes became very inactive, and humans were selected to become way more active. And then if you look at resting metabolism, humans also were selected to have huge, high resting metabolisms. And the question, and I don't have time to talk about this today, but what is it that enabled humans to escape this trade-off, this constraint that other animals face, right? Where they trade off activity and resting metabolism. And we think the answer, again, is thermoregulation, because we have the ability to dump heat when we're really active, right? And that's an incredible adaptation. But that's another lecture. Okay, so I hope I've convinced you that we evolved to be unusually active compared to our ancestors, right? We evolved to ramp up our physical activity levels by at least 2.5-fold compared to chimpanzees, right? But here's an important but. We evolved to do this in environments where energy was limited, right? There was no Whole Foods or 7-Eleven or I don't know what you have down here, Piggly Wiggly or whatever, depending on where I am, whatever. I mean, if you're a hunter-gatherer, any food that you get, you have to go out and get it that day, right? You have to work hard to get your food, right? So we evolved to be physically active, pump that energy into not only being very physically active, but also having high resting metabolisms, but in extremely energy limited environments, right? And when that happens, you have some important consequences. And one of those consequences is that we evolved to spend energy on physical activity wisely, right? nobody, so like this morning when I got up, I went to the gym in the hotel and I did like a 4-mile run or so. I can guarantee you that there are no hunter-gatherers who do that, right? Going for a 4-mile run in the morning for no purpose at all, other than to satisfy your dopamine receptors, is a terrible, stupid idea because you just wasted 400 calories that you could spend on something else, right? This is not something, so we evolved to be physically active for 2 reasons only, and 2 reasons only. When it's necessary, in other words, to get dinner or avoid being somebody else's dinner, or when it's rewarding in some other way, right? And otherwise, we evolved to conserve energy, right? Because we're in energy limited environments. And the equation of life is food in equals babies out, right? More food in, more babies out. And if you spend that energy on physical activity, you're damaging your reproductive success. So I said before, the average hunter-gatherer spends about 2.25 hours a day on moderate to vigorous physical activity. They spend many hours a day on light physical activity. But when they're not being active, they sit. The average hunter-gatherer sits 10 hours a day, which is basically the same as Americans. So when you hear people say that, our chairs are out to kill us and we sit too much, et cetera, that's just nonsense. It's not true. There are differences in how we sit, like you're sitting with backs on our chairs and, we're not squatting on the ground, et cetera. We get up less frequently, but the amount of sitting we do actually hasn't really changed very much. Okay, so that's the evolution of our hunter-gatherer system, right? To be very physically active, be physically active as much, as little as possible, to sit as much as possible, plow that energy into babies, right? Then everything started to change with the origins of agriculture, which is about 600 generations ago, about 12,000 years ago in the Middle East, maybe about 11,000 years ago in China, more recently in some other parts of the world. Very complicated story, but farmers work really hard. But these are farmers from the area in Kenya where we've been working. I actually tried using that plow. It's one of the hardest things I've ever done in my life. People carry water, right? When we want water, we just turn the tap, right? But for people in most of the world, they have to go and get the water and carry it back. They have to carry their food. They have to carry the fuel that they're going to use to cook and heat their houses. They have to carry their children. They have to carry everything, right? No shopping carts, right? And so if you actually measure, I showed you before the activity metabolic quotients, here are hunter-gatherers about 1.3. Farmers are crazy high. We have the population in Rwanda we've been working with. Their activity quotient is 1.9. They're twice as active as your average mammal, right? They are working really, really hard, okay? And now, of course, many of us live in this modern industrial environment. We have machines that do all our labor. We have shopping carts. We have escalators. We have elevators. We have, you don't even have to brush your teeth anymore. You have a machine. You have electric toothbrushes. I mean, I could go on, right? And of course, we've had this amazing decline. So humans in the United States have very low activity quotients. Around the world, it's a little bit higher, but still, it's been a dramatic, at least 50% decline since the era of farming and hunting and gathering. Okay, and of course, we all know, I don't have to tell people in a PM&R department that there's been an enormous cost to human health, right? So many of you may know this famous paper. This was in JAMA a few years ago. This is an enormous study of Europeans and Americans, over 660,000 people. On the x-axis is minutes per week of moderate to vigorous physical activity. So the histogram is the percentage of adults who are engaging in that level of physical activity. So most of us are inactive. And of course, very few people, by the time you get up to 700 minutes a week, there are very, very few individuals doing this, right? And then there's a few crazy people doing ultra stuff, right? And then in the blue line here is the relative risk of all-cause mortality, age adjusted, of course. And you can see that even getting 150 minutes a week of moderate to vigorous physical activity, that's 21 minutes a day, results in a 30% reduction in mortality risk. I mean, that's massive, right? 30% reduction. And if you get up to hunter-gatherer levels, you have about a 40% reduction. This is, I don't think, news to anybody, right? You all know that physical activity is important, but one of the questions is why, right? So because it's important, we invented this thing called exercise. And I define exercise as discretionary, voluntary physical activity for the sake of health and fitness, right? And this is a very weird, modern Western thing, right? Nobody, when I go to Kenya or Tanzania or Rwanda and go for a run in the morning, they think I am crazy. Like, why would anybody do that, right? In Mexico, they call me, they say, oh, gringo loco. They say all kinds of crazy things. In Swahili, I'm Zungu Wazimu, right? Which means a crazy white guy, right? Literally, they shout that at me, right? Okay. But as I said before, we've invented exercise because we no longer have to be physically active, because we've substituted necessary physical activity for discretionary optional physical activity, but only a few of us have. But again, the problem is that that goes against our instincts, right? We evolved to be physically active. We were selected to be physically active for, again, for two reasons and two reasons only: when it's necessary or rewarding. And we all know this situation, right? I was in the airport yesterday. Everybody lines up to take the escalator, and almost nobody's taking the staircase. And by the way, I have to admit, I photoshopped that woman on because I thought it would just look too extreme, right? But when they have escalators next to staircases, people have done this studies all over the world. They've done it in America and Israel and Japan and Sweden and various other countries. But the worldwide average is about 5% of people will take the stairs, and about 95% of people will take the escalator. It doesn't matter where you are. Okay? This is a basic instinct. But the problem is, as we said before, is that we know that physical activity is really important for health. We know that it slows senescence, and we know that it decreases vulnerability to a wide range of diseases. And so the question is, why is that the case, right? So that's what I want to kind of end this lecture with. And our answer to this is what we call the active grandparent hypothesis. And this is a paper I co-wrote with my colleague and friend Aaron Bagish and Ayman Lee from Harvard Medical School. The basic idea is that there was selection in human evolution for us to engage not just in physical activity, but in lifelong physical activity, and that activity we evolved to do it in order to feed our children and grandchildren, but in turn, the consequences of that physical activity help extend our lifespan so that we can actually have long lives and therefore long health spans. And before modern medicine, remember, health span equals lifespan, right? And before you have doctors to kind of keep you alive, your health span really pretty much determined your lifespan. And I think that for me, the big motivation for this was the evidence that as we get older, physical activity doesn't become less important, it actually becomes more important for health. There are many, many studies, but you probably all know this famous study that was published in 1986 in New England Journal of Medicine by Ralph Paffenbarger. But this is the Harvard alumni study, so of course it's my university, so I'm a little proud of it. But what Paffenbarger realized is just like with, I mean, you're all alums of various universities, right? And how often do universities contact you for money, right? All the time, right? And the universities are really good at keeping track of us and asking us for money at every stage of our life. And Paffenbarger thought, what a great system. I can actually do a prospective longitudinal study, taking advantage of the fact that Harvard is mercenary about trying to get money from its alums, and ask them if I can also collect some data when they ask for money. And he did that and followed over 21,000 alums for 25 years. And got data on their physical activity. Now, this is not the best data, it's self-reported, so I wouldn't totally believe it, but there are other studies that are better, but this is the first. And he showed that alums who get 2,000 calories a week of physical activity, so that's, like go for a short run 4 times a week, right? We're not talking crazy amounts of physical activity. In their 20s to 50s, 20s to the 40s, had 21% lower death rates than their sedentary colleagues. Or classmates, I should say. And this, of course, corrected for a variety of factors, right? In their 50s, they had 36% lower mortality rates. By the time you get to your 70s or 80s, people who exercised had 50% lower mortality rates than their classmates. And this has been replicated many, many different times in many studies. And this is just one study, but this is well known, right? Now, why is this the case? Well, I think it's the case because humans evolved to have an unusual life history, right? So chimpanzees are pretty much mature by the age of 12 and 13, and they reproduce until the age of about 30 or so, and very few chimpanzees in the wild survive past the age of 30. In zoos, they can last till their 50s or so, and this is very rare, and in the wild, they can sometimes last for long, but very few chimpanzees last longer than about 30, 40 years in the wild. Again, they can last longer, but they rarely do. Whereas humans from non-Western environments with no medicine whatsoever, so these are hunter-gatherers, typically have a lot longer period of development, a very long period of adult period, where they can reproduce up until maybe their 40s or so. And they have a very long post-reproductive period. I'm sorry, this should be wrong. This should be starting around 50 at least. And so in a hunter-gatherer population, at least 25% of the individuals are post-reproductive. We evolved to be grandparents, right? That's actually part of our system. And what grandparents are doing is, what we've done is we've extended, because in most species, natural selection doesn't care about you once you stop reproducing. You enter what's called the selective shadow. But natural selection cares about us when we're elderly, because we hunt and gather and do things to help our children and our grandchildren so that they can survive. So we've reduced the selective shadow by extending this post-reproductive period. And the important thing is that hunter-gatherers are active during that post-reproductive period. They're digging, they're walking, they're climbing, they're hunting, they're doing all kinds of physical activity in order to help their children and their grandchildren. Now, I should also point out that genes are important here, but if you look at the data, and maybe there are people in this room who are more expert on this, but so far, the evidence, hunting for genes that explain longevity, these genes don't seem to kick in and have any heritability until you're about sometime in your 70s or 80s, right? So and the average lifespan, by the way, of hunter-gatherers, if they survive childhood, is 68 to 78 years. So the idea that hunter-gatherers die young is wrong, right? Because if you correct for infant mortality, the modal age of death is between 68 and 78. Okay. And of course, we know that the major causes of premature death, again, there's papers in all kinds of journals, including New England Journal of Medicine, are primarily explained by environment, not by genes, or for that matter, access to healthcare. Okay. And so why is this important? Because, again, as I said before, in the past, what really mattered was your health span, right? So people used to live with long health spans. They had very short period of morbidity before they died. With the origins of farming, people's health spans and lifespans shrank because of living with animals and, lack of sewers and vaccines and all that kind of stuff. And today we've extended our lifespans primarily, but not so much by expanding our health spans. The average American lifespan today is 79. The average American's health span is 63, right? So if we didn't have medical care, a lot of people would be dying a lot younger. Okay, so here's the hypothesis. Two predictions. The first is that we have evolved to be more physically active than apes, especially as we age. And the second is that there's been selection for physical activity to promote health span, hence lifespan, via energy trade-offs, right? And there are two trade-offs I'm going to very, very briefly mention. I could do lectures on both of them, but the one is that we devote energy away from harmful processes that cause premature death, and we allocate more energy towards repair and maintenance processes. Let me just briefly go through both of these. So I already showed you the data on physical activity levels, right? That we are way more active than apes, right? I already showed you those data, so I don't have to belabor it. But here's the other thing that's really cool, is that we evolved to stay physically active as we age. So here's some data from Herman Ponzer and Dave Reichland and Brian Wood from Hadza hunter-gatherers in Tanzania. And they show that Hadza do decrease their physical activity levels as they age. But even 70-year-old hunter-gatherers, right? We're talking 70, 80-year-old hunter-gatherers are getting more than 200 minutes a day of moderate to vigorous physical activity, right? That's per day. Remember, that's the WHO asks us to get that once a week, right? This is what they're getting every day. So so Americans, of course, are also getting less active as they age. So Hadza hunter-gatherers are like 10 to 15 times more active, physically active, even in their 70s and 80s. Here's a bit of evidence for it. This is actually not even captured, but this is mostly walking and things like that. This is digging. These are minutes per day spent digging. These are young Hadza, these are mothers, these are grandmothers. Grandmothers are actually spending more time per day digging than mothers to dig up tubers, et cetera. And it's fairly active physical activity, right? And again, they're getting those tubers to give the food to their children and their grandchildren. Typically, there's about 2,000 calories transmitted per day from grandparents to grandchildren in hunter-gatherer societies, data from Haley Kaplan and his colleagues. Okay, so we evolved to be physically active and to stay physically active as we age. And the second part of this hypothesis is that physical activity is part of the secret sauce of our extended lifespan and health span, right? And the reason for that is that physical activity is stressful. We all know that, right? When you go for a run or walk or whatever, right, you're spending energy. So if you walk 9 to 15 kilometers a day, you're spending 250 to 500 calories a day walking. And furthermore, when you do all that physical activity, you're causing all kinds of damage throughout your body, right? When your mitochondria are producing all that ATP, they're spewing out reactive oxygen species, right, that cause damage throughout the body, right? You're damaging your mitochondria. You're shortening the telomeres. You're causing DNA mutations. You're glycating proteins. I mean, we could go on. You're cracking your bones. You're causing micro tears in your muscles. Every single tissue in your body is stressed by physical activity, right? But the good news is that because we evolved to be physically active, our bodies evolved to deal with that, right? And there are two allocation trade-offs that I want to talk about. One is that when we're physically active, we decrease the excess energy allocation to harmful things, namely fat storage and excess reproductive hormones, and we increase energy allocation to repair and maintenance functions. Let me just briefly go over both of those. So if you want to lose weight, exercise is not the best way. But if you want to prevent weight gain, exercise is incredibly important. Study after study after study shows that physical activity is incredibly important for preventing weight gain. And it's been well studied. Here's an example from my colleague, Bente Peterson, who I've been collaborating with in Denmark. She got a bunch of, this is just one of many studies, right? But she got a bunch of young sort of Vikings, Danish guys who are normally physically active, and had them eat the exact same amount of food, but had them sit on a couch basically for 2 weeks and scan them before and after. And you can see just those 2 weeks of inactivity caused a 7% increase in visceral fat. And there are plenty of other studies which maybe not quite as dramatic as this, but we know that physical activity prevents fat storage. We even know the mechanisms by which it occurs. We can talk about that later on. Here's another really wonderful study. It was done by my colleague Peter Ellison at Harvard, where they looked at women who are just running 20 kilometers a week. So this is not a lot of running, right? Around the Charles River, and compared them with healthy controls. And during the luteal phase of the menstrual cycle, the runners had about 50% lower rates of progesterone. Another study showed the same is true for estrogen, right? Now, you could say, oh, what they're doing is that the running is decreasing the physical activity, decreasing the hormone levels. But as an evolutionary biologist, I would say it's the absence of any physical activity that's actually causing selection, is causing those hormone levels to increase, right? Because this is not enough to make anybody unfecund or infertile, right? That's what's happening, is that if you have extra energy, the body says, ooh, extra energy, let's plow it into reproduction, because after all, what does natural selection care about? It cares about reproduction, right? How many offspring you have, right? So you have higher levels of reproductive hormones. And of course, less fat and lower levels of hormones help explain, less inflammation, because we know that enlarged fat cells cause inflammation throughout the body. Of course, very high levels of reproductive hormones increase breast cancer rates. I mean, the evidence is that women who get 150 minutes a week of physical activity have 30 to 50% lower lifetime risks of breast cancer. 30 to 50%, and that's not a controversial statement, and I'll be happy to give you references for that if you don't believe me. Okay, so that's the part of it. So that physical activity decreases energy towards processes that cause harm to our long-term health. But then the other point is that physical activity also turns on repair and maintenance and also capacity building mechanisms, right? Because remember, when you're physically active, you're causing stress throughout your body, but for every one of those forms of stress, the body turns on appropriate repair and maintenance mechanism. Here's just a few of them, right? Because I actually had a lot more slides of this, but I realized I was going to run out of time, so I removed some of them. But for example, when you exercise, you produce tons of antioxidants, right? That actually more than completely compensate for the fact that you're producing reactive oxygen species. And by the way, if you give somebody vitamin C when they're exercising, they produce fewer antioxidants, which is one of the reasons not to give people sports drinks when they're running. You promote mitochondrial growth with upregulation of PGC1 alpha, right? You promote enzymes that repair DNA. We produce BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic growth factor, right? Which involved it as a myokine, as a muscle, in muscles to liberate fat, and later got co-opted by the brain, by the central nervous system, to promote neuronal growth and synaptic health and reduce inflammation in the brain. We actually produce myokines that suppress inflammation. People think of IL-6 as being pro-inflammatory, but at very high levels, IL-6 actually turns off inflammation. And guess what produces the most IL-6? Active skeletal muscle. You can produce 100 times more IL-6 with skeletal muscle than white blood cells can produce. And this is an experiment we did by just 3 hours of walking doubles your IL-6 levels at the level that causes inflammation suppression. When you're physically active, you turn up your production of natural killer cells. You increase the humoral antibody production system. I could go on, right? So for all of these things, these have advantages, right? It lowers aging, it prevents sarcopenia, it helps prevent dementia, decreases any kind of inflammatory disease, infectious disease. During COVID, Kaiser Permanente, which collects data on physical activity levels, showed that Californians who got 150 minutes of physical activity had 2.5 times lower rates of death from COVID before the vaccines were developed. 2.5. Again, happy to give you the reference. So again, going back to the active grandparent hypothesis, that humans evolved to be more physically active than apes and to stay active as we age. I think we can say that's true. I think we can also say that there was selection for all kinds of responses to physical activity that slow aging and promote health span, which of course is important for lifespan. And then finally, I don't have time to talk about this today, but I think there's compelling evidence that there was special selection in human evolution for these features in humans that we don't actually see in other mammals. So if you put rats on a treadmill or mice on a treadmill, you don't actually extend their lifespan. But that's another lecture. But finally, I want to just mention is that important point is that because we never evolved to be physically inactive, we never evolved to turn on these mechanisms in the absence of physical activity, because that just doesn't exist. I mean, a few hundred generations ago, nobody on this planet was physically inactive. It couldn't happen, right? Or at least it was extremely rare. So we never evolved to turn on these mechanisms. And that's why I titled the lecture, Is Exercise Medicine? Because in a sense, exercise, which is this very weird thing we do, is kind of physical activity. Physical activity is just a normal part of our biology. And what we've done is we've removed it from our world, and we're just basically restoring it. So in this sense, I don't think exercise is medicine. It's just what we evolved to do. Right? So it's not like a pill that you're taking, right? And it doesn't work in a dose-response way, the way a lot of medications do. So obviously it's medicinal. It's obviously great. It's wonderful, but it's not really the same thing as a medicine. And so when we're persistently inactive, it's what we call a mismatch disease, right? It increases our vulnerability to disease, it increases our rate of senescence, and it reduces our health span, which in the absence of medical care also reduces our lifespan. And then finally, one last thing is that if we're trying to encourage more people to be physically active, remember, we evolved to be physically active for 2 reasons and 2 reasons only, right? When it was necessary or rewarding. And I think if we want to try to help people be more physically active, there's nothing wrong with prescribing exercise. We should do it, right? But medicalizing exercise has not been shown to be very effective, right? It's important to make a distinction between efficacy and effectiveness. Exercise has extremely high efficacy, but prescriptions tend to have low effectiveness. And if we're going to try to get more people to be physically active, we have to figure out how to make those prescriptions increase their effectiveness. And that's going to involve more than just medicine. It's going to involve public health. It's going to involve political change. It's going to involve many other dimensions beyond just medicine. Okay, and with that, I'd like to again thank the Palmers again for inviting me and all kinds of other folks. And if you're interested, I wrote a book on this stuff, and there's some papers, including one that's just about to come out in PNAS, I think in a few weeks. And with that, thank you so much, and I'd love to answer questions.
Thank you. Any questions for Dr. Newman?
Got to be at least one question, yes.
I can't resist talking my own talk. So I want to point out that those of us who work in rehabilitation, we're constantly faced with people like me who have physical problems that make it difficult for us to be physically active. And it behooves us in PM&R to work with everyone we can on finding ways ways to solve that dilemma. And of course, one advantage that physically disabled people have is that it takes more energy to do things. So for me to walk across the room takes a lot more energy than for Dan to walk across the room. But that doesn't make up all that I've lost along the way. So this is a challenge for us. And I hope that some of us, and I'm thinking especially about our postdocs, will attack this sort of problem, and maybe that this gives an opportunity for people to think about what we do from an evolutionary perspective. And I gotta say that meeting Fuzz Crompton and having the ability to collaborate with him, and meeting Dan so many years ago, and having him push me towards an evolutionary perspective on the problems that I was working on, just changed my life in a fundamental way. And so I hope that some of you will take that opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Palmer. Any other questions?
Back there.
Yes, Dr. Lieberman, you had mentioned, what was the percentage of exercise that for women to decrease their chances of breast cancer? How many hours per week or?
So there are a lot of studies on this, but of course it's the good dose response studies aren't really there. So these are of course retrospective studies because you can't do it, and there's some, I think there's some prospective studies as well, like the ACLS study in Texas. But I think the average estimate, again, so like this is a meta-analysis I'm doing in my brain right now, right? Because different studies get different, but the average is that about 150 minutes a week of moderate to vigorous physical activity per week reduces a woman's lifetime risk of breast cancer by somewhere between 30 and 50%. I mean, different studies come up with different numbers for obvious reasons, but it's a substantial number. And we know why, right? If you think about it, physical activity decreases insulin, right? And insulin is carcinogenic, right? Physical activity decreases, other levels of glucose in the blood, and then you have the Warburg effect. Physical activity increases the population of natural killer cells and cytotoxic C cells, which and also increases their circulation in the body, which again help identify and get rid of cancerous cells. I mean, I could go on, right? There are many mechanisms by which physical activity has these effects. And of course, for breast cancer, physical activity decreases otherwise abnormally high estrogen and progesterone levels, which also increase physical activity. Remember, breast cancer used to be called the nuns' disease, right? Because who got it? They noticed that nuns who had many more menstrual cycles because they weren't reproducing were more likely to get breast cancer. So there are it's not only just an epidemiological data set. We have the mechanistic evidence that backs it up. I'm not sure if there's enough really good studies on that, but I suspect there's a dose response effect, and more is going to be better up to a certain point, and then I mean, the general rule with exercise is that some is always better than none. You tend to get increased benefit, and then at some point it tails off. But it's different for every. It's very hard to do that because it differs by disease category. Right? Like Ayman Lee at Harvard has been doing a lot of work on step counts, and she can show that all-cause mortality rates tend to level off about 7,000 to 8,000 steps per day. But if you do like cardiovascular disease, she can't find any leveling off of that curve. The more steps, the better. So and there's a lot of variation around those means, right? Because it's going to depend on your age, it's going to depend on your gender, it's going to depend on your physical fitness history, it depends on body composition, and there's lots of genetic differences. So it's going to be very, very, very hard to kind of come up with a dose-like prescription. That's never going to happen. But more is better than none. Some is better than none, excuse me.
Hey, Chuck, it's out of curiosity, why would exercise increase lifespan in human and non-human?
Because of that, so the reason, the question is, why does exercise increase lifespan in humans, not other animals? And I think it's because of, again, our unique life history system, because we evolved to be grandparents who forage, create a surplus, and give that surplus to our offspring. Chimpanzees don't do that. Chimpanzees don't share food. So a grandparent chimpanzee who stopped reproducing can provide no benefit to its children or grandchildren. But in humans, we've got this hunting and gathering system whereby if you live long and you stay active as you continue to age, that activity, which of course is hunting and gathering, provides energy, food for your offspring. And so then there's now a selective benefit. And so the selection for the responses to that physical activity to increase health span, which of course is what really matters, right? Has an added selective benefit in humans that it doesn't in other species.
But the molecular mechanism that you pointed out, it all works in animal as well. With the subject animal exercise,
No.
IL-6, for example, it was robustly secreted in mice, and many other species people have tested.
Sure, but well, actually, the IL-6 system is a little different in mice, actually. I'll be happy to talk about that a little bit later on. Yeah, and it's true. A lot of these, physical activity, I mean, if there weren't benefits to physical activity, animals that were physically active would perish, right, very early on in their life, right? But I think there's been extra selection for what we call, and I haven't get a chance to go into it, but what we call an overshoot effect, right? So when we are physically active, the metaphor I often use, or the analogy I often use, is like you spill coffee on the floor, right? And then you clean up the floor. The floor is often more clean after you clean up the floor, after you spill the coffee, than before. So what we've done is we've devoted extra energy towards that overshoot, right? To the extra repair and maintenance that has greater benefits. So if you look at rodents, if you exercise rodents, they don't actually live longer. If you look at zoo animals versus wild animals, zoo animals who are less physically active actually live longer than wild animals after you correct for predation. So the evidence suggests that there's something special about the human response to physical activity. It's hard to study, but we think that there's something going on. Yeah. Great question.
I think your talk made it starkly clear that there's an evolutionary origin for some of these more aerobic activities. These hunters and gatherers are hours and hours of activity a day, but now we're seeing in our population probably high intensity, more anaerobic training, shorter duration. Do you think some of those relationships still exist, or is there a difference between more of that aerobic and
Oh, I
anaerobic
love that
activity?
question. Thank you. I mean, we've all to do all kinds of stuff, right? And actually, one of my grad students is actually working on the evolution of sarcopenia and strength training. So humans didn't evolve just to do aerobic physical activity. I didn't talk about it. It's easier for us to measure step counts and heart rates, et cetera, in the field than strength. But obviously, hunter-gatherers, and we do have grip strength data, for example, but hunter-gatherers also, and farmers are also doing a lot of strength-related activities. And we all know that sarcopenia is one of the most serious issues of aging in our population today. And that, of course, is a very much, because it's a use it or lose it system, right? If you don't use your muscle, it atrophies because muscle's expensive, right? So you don't want to spend any more energy on your muscle than you need to because you can spend that energy on reproduction. So that's why, if you use your muscle, it hypertrophies, and if you don't use it, it goes away. Sorry. I did get enough sleep last night, actually. So I think that's also important, right? So it's not just aerobic physical activity. We evolved to do a wide diversity of physical activities, and they all have different sort of benefits. And we all know that for healthy aging requires, the general recommendations are not only doing some amount of aerobic, cardio, but also doing at least 2 strength training episodes per week. And I think that's, again, that has an evolutionary origin. I didn't talk about it today, but thank you for asking that.
Yeah, we have a question from the virtual crowd. It says, considering that we've evolved to become lazy in the industrialized age, are we more prone to exercise regression? In other words, do these new adaptations make us worse when we fall back on our lazy ways?
I'm not sure if I understand the question. I mean, I
I'm
think
not sure either, but
I mean, we certainly evolved. I mean, one of the things I just don't really like is this idea that we're lazy, right? I think that, remember, we often make, reason I entitled my book Exercised is that I think we make people exercised about exercise. We make them feel shamed and bad about themselves, right? It's a basic, fundamental, innate instinct to avoid unnecessary physical activity. So I wouldn't call it laziness. I would call it instinct. And we've simply created a world where people no longer have to be physically active, and so they can, their instincts are going to be very important, right? So it's not that they're lazy; they're just following basic, ancient, fundamental, deep, adaptive instincts. And as long as we have, buildings where you can't find the stairs and you have to take the elevator, or as long as we have, shopping carts and cars and whatever, and physical activity is optional, people are going to follow their instincts. I mean, the other sort of issue is that we also have environments where it's very hard to be physically active in poor environments where they're not playgrounds, they're not, sidewalks, et cetera. And then Jeff mentioned a very important point too, which is, of course, individuals with disabilities. Also, we have to do more to help them, be physically active. And until we kind of grapple with these problems, this isn't going to go away, right?
How can you make exercise more fun for me?
I think that, well, there's no one solution, right? Everybody is different. I think my reading of the literature, again, and I'm more of a physiologist, biomechanist than a psychologist, but I think for most people, the best exercise isn't actually exercise, it's something that's social, right? So when you, like, I don't know, maybe you like to dance. I don't, do you like to dance? Oh, too bad. Well, most people like to dance, right? And they don't think of dancing as exercise, right? It's just a social thing you do with other people, but it actually is. It's physical activity, right? Going for walks with people. I have some running buddies, and we meet early in the morning. And like one is a professor who lives down the road, and we meet at like 7 a.m. And if I'm not there, she's going to be pissed at me, right? So even though it's a cold winter morning in Boston, I do not want to be out there. But Elena is going to get really mad at me if I'm not out there at 7 to go running with her, right? And I usually am grumbling, and my wife is like, "Why, whatever." But then I'm always happy afterwards, right? So the other issue is there are reward systems like dopamine, right? And one of the challenges of physical activity if people are unfit is that they often have dopamine insensitivity. So it takes months of physical activity and increasing their fitness before they get that dopamine reward. So sometimes it takes time. You have to kind of get over that hurdle. Or I don't know. I mean, everyone has to figure out their own way, right? There's no one solution, but I think the challenge is to help us. So when we prescribe exercise, maybe instead of prescribing exercise, how about finding out from your patients what they like to do that involves physical activity and prescribing that instead? And then you're not making then you're not medicalizing exercise. You're making suggestions about lifestyle that can lead to physical activity that can help them be more physically active.
Yeah.
I
Well,
wish I had a simple answer to your question, but I don't.
On that note, apologies for some of the questions that were left online, but thank you, Dr. Lieberman. We have a small
My
token
pleasure.
of our appreciation
No, thank you.
that we'd like to share for doing the lectureship. And please join us in the atrium. We're going to have a small reception. There's food, and we all like that as well.
Thank you. Thank you. This will go on my office wall. Thank
You
you.
exceeded my expectations. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.